Hi, this is Emily Deaton, and you're listening to my friend Matthew Shapiro's podcast, Six Wheels Consulting Disability.
Nice.
Welcome to the Sixth Wheels Consulting Podcast, dialoguing disability and discussing difference, inclusion, and all abilities in today's world. Now here are your hosts, Matthew Shapiro and Bob Nolly.
Hey, everybody, you're back. You're back. I can't believe it because we're getting good at this. You have found your way back to the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. I'm Dr. Bob Nolly. How are you? I'm glad to hear it. Here's my good buddy and your host, Matthew Shapiro. Matthew, how are you?
Hey, Bob, how are you, sir?
How are things going?
Doing great. Just getting ready to partake in a lot of travels coming up here very soon, and work's going really, really well. But just another day in paradise.
Another day in paradise. So where are you headed?
So I leave here in the next couple of days to go to a conference in Washington, D.C., and then, so over the next month or so, I'm going to be in D.C., I'm going to be in Vermont, and I'm going to be in Charlottesville, Virginia for a week. So got a lot of traveling on the books coming up here soon.
We'll keep up on that. We'll talk about that because I know you'll bring back good stories for us to talk about.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I always come back with great stories.
Yeah, that's good. It's good. And you and I, yes, we're definitely housebroken by now, but we always have to mind our P's and Q's because tonight we have a guest.
Yes, we do.
It's wonderful.
This is becoming a normal thing for us.
We have a lawyer in the house, which is probably good for us as well. It
could be a bad thing too, though, Bob. I don't know.
It's so wonderful to welcome Helen Hardiman to the program. Helen, welcome to the show tonight.
Thanks, Bob. I'm stoked to be here.
Oh, thanks very much. Hey, I saw in your background that you did some time, so to speak. That means something different in the legal world, perhaps. That you studied at University of Virginia.
I did. I'm actually a double who. I went there for undergrad, did a little hiatus and a little social work study, and then went back to UVA for my law degree. I'm happy to be back in Richmond, but I have the student loans to prove the UVA degrees.
Hey, I got those too. I
think my brother has those too. So
wow, it's a mountain. It's a mountain.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about your practice now?
Sure. Well, you told people I was a lawyer, so hopefully they're still listening. But I practice fair housing law all over the state. That is my background and my passion and my calling. And so I get to I'm a solo practitioner. I run my own shop. So I get to spend every day fighting for the rights of people who have been discriminated against and working with housing providers, landlords, real estate agents to help them understand their obligations under fair housing laws to prevent housing discrimination. So, Matthew, you're another day in paradise. I'm certainly living the dream myself.
Yes, absolutely. And so, oftentimes our listeners have picked up on the fact now that, whenever we have a guest, we always obviously try to tie it into disability in some form or fashion. And so, Bob and I recently had been having a lot of conversations around fair housing and with your fair housing background and how you and I initially met was doing, I guess what they call, fair housing tests or accessibility tests for housing for people with disabilities. And so that's where the disability angle comes into tonight's conversation. And we thought that it would be a really good conversation because housing is a huge barrier for people with disabilities. And so that's why, we approached you and we're excited to have you. And we also want to say thank you because the firm is actually sponsoring tonight's episode and maybe a few more episodes as well. So
applause.
Very, very grateful for that as well. So I guess, you talked about your legal background, but what got you attracted to fair housing law?
Sure, and I'm proud to sponsor it. I think you guys are doing great work, and I'm pleased to be your colleague in the fight for fair and accessible housing. So I mentioned I have a social work background. I consider myself a social worker first and a lawyer second. When I got out of social work school at VCU, Bob, I hope I still pass your.
Yeah, that's where I did. I went to school there too. Yeah.
Okay. I'm following in your footsteps. Sounds like. My first job out of social work school was actually doing policy advocacy at the State House down at the Virginia General Assembly, where Matthew is a mainstay.
I know it well.
And for those of us progressives, and this was in 2006, for those of us progressive social justice types, and I was working at a nonprofit, it was an uphill battle to lobby state legislators I was actually lobbying against payday lending, and then I started lobbying for affordable housing. And there were a lot of closed doors. There were a lot of fights about how to do the right thing and how to improve our laws so that more people had access to housing they could afford and access. And, one day I sat down and I said, I got to find a law that's already good. I'm sick of being down here trying to improve these laws and making little progress. And so I read cover to cover the Virginia Fair Housing Law. And it's not that giant of a statute.
I was going to say nerd alert, but that's okay.
It was a little nerdy, but, I was on the clock.
I've never heard a lawyer called a nerd. Hold on a second.
Wow. Okay,
all right. So you read the code. All right.
So I read the Virginia Fair Housing Law, and I thought, wow, this is already a really powerful statute. It protected a lot of people, different types of people. It covered a lot of different housing providers. It had strong enforcement mechanisms so that you could take someone to court and get a lot of damages against them. And I said, I don't need to be down here at the GA, at the General Assembly, tweaking this law. I need to be able to enforce this law. So I moved from sort of legislative stuff into litigation, took the hiatus, the very expensive 3-year hiatus for law school. Yeah. And the whole time I was in school, I just continued to fall in love with fair housing laws and how much good they could do to improve everyone's access to housing, which, as you guys know, is a major cornerstone of everyone's quality of life. So I'm so lucky to be able to continue to do this, 12 years later, but I heart fair housing for life.
So let me insert this really quickly here. So having said that, in your experience with this segment of the law here, are we getting better or worse at it? Rather, not we. Is the legislation making housing more accessible, or there's still too many challenges left to bear?
So when you say making housing accessible, I think that could be interpreted in multiple ways. I think the current law, sort of the baseline law, is, again, strong. And I don't see consistent or productive efforts to chip away at it. We need to be vigilant. And I think certainly at the federal level, there are some efforts at HUD to weaken the law, which is a problem. We need to play defense in that way.
And so weaken it would make it worse, correct?
Exactly. And there are some efforts to make it stronger that I don't think the Virginia General Assembly is poised, at least with this current configuration, to pass. But I think we're doing okay, Bob. We can talk about what the law mandates in terms of physical accessibility for housing. And I think that is, not being followed by builders as much as it should be. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't really apply to a giant swath of housing opportunities. So even in the small segment that it does apply to, it's not being followed. So I think we have a way to go.
Well, so that's a perfect so I have 2 follow-up questions to that. One, you said that the one of the big struggles is that because of the way the General Assembly currently is, we're not seeing much of an increase in that. So I'll first ask, why do you think that is? And then I'll follow up with another question.
Matthew, you probably know better than I do, but it's politics.
Yeah.
There have been efforts for, at least a decade to add to the list of protected classes in the fair housing law. So currently it says you can't discriminate against someone because of their race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, family status, or age, elderliness. And there have been efforts to add to that list, right, of prohibited bases for discrimination, sexual orientation, gender identity, and source of income, meaning how someone's going to be paying for their housing. And every year, it gets a little further every year, which I guess is promising, but at the end of the day, those efforts die in the House of Delegates.
Yes, the good old super friendly House of Delegates. I know it well. So why, sort of pivoting to specifically to the disability angle, why do you think that it's such a challenge? And I can relate to this. You and I've had conversations offline about this many a times, but why do you think it's such a challenge for people with disabilities to find housing that, one, is affordable and two, is accessible to their needs?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer.
I wish so too. That would be great.
Yeah, let me back up and just say why I think disability is one of the most important, if not the most important, protected class. The majority of complaints of housing discrimination in the country, in Virginia, and at Hardiman Law are people alleging discrimination based on disability. So the most complaints are lodged under this protected class. It's also, it's well over 50% too. It's not just, the largest. It's like a big majority of the complaints. Okay. And I think part of the reason for that is disability is a special protected class because there are 3 extra protections in the laws just for people with disabilities that don't apply to the other protected classes. So just like you can't refuse to rent to someone because of their race, color, religion, or disability, disabilities on that list, right? You can't treat someone differently because of their disability. But also housing providers have an affirmative duty to do 3 extra things for people with disabilities, right? So this is more of like a proactive, they have to do these things. Right. And those are grant reasonable accommodations to policies, grant reasonable modifications, so physical changes, to structures, and to build a certain segment of housing. It's new apartment buildings, larger apartment buildings, with basic minimal adaptable features. And so because there's like those extra protections, I think there are more people whose rights are getting violated, in those 3 ways.
So what you're saying is like someone is being discriminated against because they're not meeting those 3 extra protections?
Right. So most of the cases that I work on where people with disabilities are being discriminated against or they're about to be discriminated against is when they're asking for reasonable accommodations and policies that they need because of their disability in order to fully use and enjoy their housing. And those run the gamut, and we could spend 17 podcasts talking about reasonable accommodations. I jotted down a handful of cases that I've worked on the past year if we want to talk about those. But those, people with disabilities are individuals who have disabilities that manifest in very individualized ways.
Sure.
I'm not telling you anything you don't know. People who even have the same disability or the same diagnosis have different needs in order to meet their particular symptoms of disabilities. And so they're so case specific that someone may need something small from a landlord in order to live peacefully, and someone might need something a little bigger. And I don't think that landlords, or frankly the general public, understand that these are individualized inquiries and that landlords have a duty to accommodate, to respond in a way to these requests that allow people, all of us, many of us who have a disability, all of us who could have a disability at any given moment, to be able to fully use and enjoy our housing, which is a fundamental civil human right.
Absolutely. And I love it because you're hitting on a lot of the kind of buzz phrases and buzzwords that we use regularly on the podcast. And, one of those that you touch on is like the fact that you can't cookie cutter everyone's disability just based on the diagnosis that they have. But as you said, just because one person has CP or some other disability doesn't mean that the next person that landlord's going to come across who has that same disability is going to kind of have those same needs and need those same accommodations. So you're certainly preaching to the choir in that sense. I would love. You said you jotted down a couple of cases, but I'd love to like dive into one just to give our listeners kind of an example of what one might come across, and if you want to use me as the as the guinea pig plaintiff person, so you don't have to give any info away, you're more than welcome to do that.
Okay. Well, gosh, I don't know which one to pick, and I'm certainly not going to name any names.
Absolutely.
But, I'm looking at a dozen that I worked on in the past year. One of my favorite, and I will say that just because I think this case highlights the intersection between people with disabilities needing accommodations and also the damage that can be done to people who have criminal histories.
Sure.
From the past that
Sure.
continues to follow them and affect their ability to get housing. In this particular case, I had a client with a mental disability that caused her to have some manic episodes, which caused disorganized thinking and lack of sort of social awareness and norms. And when she was off her prescribed medication to mitigate the symptoms of that disability, she would go into a manic state and she would go into like a CVS and she would shoplift. Mm-hmm. She wasn't like surreptitious about it. She was just, in a state where she didn't realize that she couldn't do that. So she would like steal a pack of gum.
Sure.
And then she would get charged and convicted. And so she had lived in this apartment complex as a good tenant, paying her rent, not disturbing anyone for 3 years. New management came in. They said, you have to basically re-qualify based on our new standards. They ran her criminal background. They saw various larceny convictions, and they were going to evict her. And she said, I'm not, risks to anyone that's here. My criminal convictions are directly related to my disability. Mm-hmm. And my doctor has this beautiful treatment plan for me. She will vouch for me. I'm on my medication. Like, here's the plan for me to stay healthy. And again, I haven't disturbed any neighbors. So we wrote her a reasonable accommodation letter that said, hey, new property management company, A, she's not a risk. B, these convictions are a direct result of her disability. Please let her stay. And sure. They did the right thing. They granted that, within the week. And now she can rest easy knowing that her housing's secure.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Do you have an example, just as somebody who is a mobility device user, do you have an example of where somebody, I guess would have asked for, as you mentioned earlier, one of those reasonable accommodations and they sort of ran into some challenges?
Yeah, Matthew, let me talk about the case that I was actually mentioning to you because I was looking for some expert advice about this particular assistive device.
Sure.
So you may remember this is down in Hampton Roads. I have a client with Friedreich's ataxia, which is a genetic disorder that affects the nervous system. And so he, over the course of his life, has become less coordinated with gross motor skills. So he has trouble kind of walking, speaking, swallowing sometimes. And he is on a fixed income, a limited income, and which is pretty low. And so he finally found an apartment in the area of town that he wanted to be in that he could qualify income-wise. And let me tell you, he had this crazy housing search because he couldn't find anything that was accessible and affordable. So he finally found.
And honestly, because not like that, and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that right there is a problem in itself, is that there's not a ton of options for accessible and affordable housing, which is a whole nother debate in itself, but please continue. No,
you're exactly right. So the fact that he was able to find, this unicorn meant the world to him. So he was, especially excited. He had been kind of cramped. He'd been crammed into his mom's trailer where he was living with 5 other people, which was affecting his ability to, move around and take care of himself. So he was really stoked to find this housing. He goes, he applies, he qualifies. They do all the background check. He cleans up his credit. He's like ready to go. They give him a unit number. He's just waiting for the unit to become available. He goes and buys a bunch of new furniture. I mean, the guy's on cloud 9.
Right.
And then before he goes to move in, he goes to see the actual unit. So now it's been turned, right? The person moved out. It's ready to go.
So he had not seen the unit before now, correct?
He had seen a similar unit, but it was in a different location in the complex. So He didn't know which exact unit he was going to get. So now he's told, okay, it's this unit, you can come see it. And he realizes that at the building entrance, there is a series of 3, I hate to even call them steps. You would probably perceive them as steps. I would say they're 2 to 3 inch high thresholds.
Sure.
That are I don't know, 3 feet wide on a sidewalk, but they're separated by a good 7 to 10 feet each. So they're relatively gradual sloping up, but they're steps, they're barriers.
Sure.
And he, at the time that he's been interacting with his housing provider, has been not using a mobility device / using a walker to get in and out of the car, but leaving it in the car. But as we talked about, no, disability is perfectly predictable and understandable. His symptoms fluctuate with various things like the weather or his mental health, et cetera. So he says when he goes to see the unit and he notices these steps, by the way, sometimes I use my electric scooter to get in and around. I have this really cool temporary aluminum fold-up ramp that would be really easy for me to put down to get over these relatively shallow steps. And once I'm over them in my scooter, I can just pick the ramp up and bring it into my apartment. Like, let's do this thing.
Sure.
All of a sudden, the housing provider that had been, perfectly okay to rent to him says, oh, I don't think we're going to be able to do that here. We can maybe think about a unit at the other end of the complex where we can build like a permanent ramp. And my client's like, no, I don't want to be on a wait list. Like, I'm ready to go. I need this housing now. Just let me use this ramp. It's not going to affect anyone.
Just to clarify, so hypothetically, let's say he was like, okay, we can look at another unit. So he would have had to have gone back on a wait list?
No, not at all. That's not for the landlord to decide, right? Unless that request to use that temporary ramp was going to be unreasonable in some way.
Right.
The landlord has to grant it.
No. I guess I'm just trying to get clarification. So you said that like the landlord was like, yeah, the ramp might not work, but maybe we can get another unit on the other side of the complex. So if the person was like, yeah, I'm cool with waiting on a new unit where maybe we can put a permanent ramp solution in. In that case, would he have had to go back on a wait list, or like how does that work? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think if my client was cool with that and wanted to go back on a wait list because of the prospective offer of having a permanent ramp built at the landlord's expense, I think he probably could have said yes to that. But I don't even know that was an appropriate offer by the landlord.
Sure.
I mean, my client never said, I need a permanent ramp or I want to build a wooden ramp or anything. He just said, in thinking back, he shouldn't have even asked or even told the landlord, because it's not like it was going to affect anyone. It's like me saying, can I use a cane to get in my house, or I have a stroller and I'm going to put down a ramp. Like, it's really, there's no request necessary.
If he didn't know, what you don't know doesn't hurt you kind of thing.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So he says, my client says, no, I want this housing now. I don't want to be on a wait list. And the landlord said, I'm sorry, the ramp that you're describing just isn't safe. And my client said, I've used it before, it's fine. And the landlord said, I don't know. I also don't want other people to hurt themselves on it. And my client said, okay, fine. Like, I will not use the ramp. I will not even bring my scooter. Like, I'm desperate for this housing. Please just.
So the landlord had not seen, because I have a fold up ramp that's like just like what you're describing. So the landlord had not seen said ramp before the conversation. Okay.
Correct.
Gotcha. Just trying to get a full picture.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the conversation that you and I had. I wasn't familiar with these kind of fold up ramps. They look, very cool, and like they would not have been at all a problem in any neighborhood that I can imagine.
Sure.
Damaged anything, bothered anyone. And finally the landlord said, no, I'm sorry, you can't live here. And my client stormed away, and the landlord put him on the wait list anyway, which I found kind of funny.
Oh, wow.
So it took my client, I want to say 6 more months to finally, I'm sorry, that was my fault. Let me close this. It took my client 6 more months to find housing that was going to meet his needs. And he has filed a fair housing complaint against that landlord, which is currently pending at the Virginia Fair Housing Office.
Sure. That's so. That just makes me.
Yeah, all the case law there is just so compelling. Hey, everybody, we're going to take a break now. What a great conversation Matthew's having with Helen Hardiman, disability lawyer here. We're going to come back and finish the conversation with Helen next time. You've been listening to episode 35 of the Six Wheels Consulting Disability Podcast. This is Bob Nolly for my friend Matthew Shapiro. Think inclusion, keep rolling forward. We'll see you next time.